Okay, Martin, welcome to the show. For anybody that isn't aware of you and your work, could you just tell us a bit about your background and how you first discovered acceptance and commitment therapy?
Yes, I think in short, I discovered it through a passionate interest in mindfulness, and that developed for me in the early 80s, first through Tai Chi and then yoga, a period of quite intense self-exploration and discovery, and I did a 10-day Vipassana retreat, which sort of set me off on, I suppose, something of a Buddhist practice path, and I began to teach mindfulness in the late 80s on the festival scene and so on and so forth. I had been an engineer in my original training, but shifted over to psychology, which once I'd got a degree, I just sort of put behind me and went off and had adventures for, I suppose, a decade or so. But coming back, I'd also got quite interested in a person-centered approach to psychology, which was not my academic experience of it at all. And through that, co-counselling, the method of a group of people, a community, a learning community, all learning the same approach to facilitating each other in their own personal inquiry, co-counselling. And I got fascinated about sorry about that. Best laid plans.
It's okay.
I got fascinated about integrating the possibilities of integrating the approach of mindfulness with the approaches of co-counselling, and I suppose to some extent anticipated what ACT was going to become much later. And then towards the end of the 90s, as I was professionalizing myself more to become a kind of a recognized therapist by doing a diploma in counseling psychology, I did some training with John Kabat-Zinn to further secularize, I suppose, my way of teaching mindfulness, and did some presentations at the Bangor Institute of Mindfulness on my work in prisons. I've been managing a counselling service in Brixton Prison for many years, using mindfulness with the counselling service. And it was there that I met a group of people who all came from London. We got a little practice group together, and somebody who attended the group mentioned to me this new approach called ACT that I might like, and I can't remember his name, but I'm grateful to him because I found that I did like it a lot, and it had a lot of flexibility, and it did a lot of the kind of integration that I was finding fascinating, and it had all been done with such thoroughness that I shifted over from, I suppose, a humanistic approach, amazingly to me, over the bridge to something which is really in the world of behavior change psychotherapy, but is so very, I suppose, welcoming of different models of therapy, really, that I found a comfortable home in that learning community.
That's a fascinating career path you've been on, Martin, so far. I'm curious to ask, what would you say the main benefits are between ACT and other forms of psychotherapy, like some of the humanistic therapies and like things like cognitive behavioral therapy? Like, what would you say are the main differentiating points of ACT and why it's so powerful?
Well, first of all, it is a very integrating model, as in somebody trained in the person-centered approach, such as myself, can feel as at home in practicing ACT as can the many CBT therapists who've transformed their practice in the direction of ACT. So it's integrative. So perhaps that's one of the advantages, is that we can be both focused upon behavior change, client behavior change, and focused upon, as we would do in the person-centered approach, very much focused upon the depth of working relationship as well, being two human beings in a room together, respecting each other's humanity, respecting each other's suffering and each other's best efforts. So that is certainly an advantage. Apologies for that second little interruption. I've got some coffee to sustain me now on the interview.
It's all good. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
So with ACT, what would you say are the core ideas that the approach is built upon?
Well, I suppose philosophically speaking, there's a core difference between a kind of a mechanistic approach to the philosophy of change, of cause and effect, towards something that we call functional contextualism, which has quite a different feel to it. The truth criteria of functional contextualism is what is true is that which works. And when you apply that to the work with one's clients, what works, what is workability, to coin a phrase, is that which helps a client move towards what truly matters to them in life. And this, in a way, this is where the values are integrated into the ACT model. So the truth of what we're doing as therapists, as a way, according to functional contextualism, is, did the intervention work? The proposed intervention in this moment that I as a therapist are thinking about, does it work or contribute towards helping the client move towards what's most important to them in their lives?
That's really interesting. I've never heard of that before. So am I getting this right? Functional contextualism is basically the idea that the truth is what works, what actually works in
Yes,
practice.
it is profoundly pragmatic in that, and that means a great deal of flexibility. And of course, you know, I think we'll be exploring that later. But when we're not bound to rules. In the ACT model, we move around. We move around the model according to what's going to work in the moment, and it's all in the service, if you like, of what we know of the client's values. And that helped me coming to this model from a person-centered place, where I deeply respected the, if you like, the rules of Carl Rogers, who, in a way, in developing the model, was back in the 50s and 60s, was pushing back against perhaps the excesses of a very mechanistic, developing behavioral psychology, delivered by somewhat inhumane scientists. And that's obviously a little stereotyping and unkind, but I'm just trying to make the point. So his was a very heartful approach, which believed in the client's self-actualizing potential, and advised strongly against the therapist directing the client in any way. So it was non-directive therapy. With ACT, by recognizing and understanding and working with the client on their values, once I as a therapist know what a client values, then I can give myself permission without, in a way, compromising those earlier principles, to help direct, because I know it is what the client wants. It is, if you like, their self-actualizing potential, is the knowing of their values. And if I can then pragmatically work with the ACT model to help direct them in the direction that they've said they want to go, then I'm both being a behavior change scientist, if you like, and I'm also being a person-centered therapist.
Practically speaking, how does ACT actually work? You know, how are the sessions structured? What are the key things that an ACT practitioner would focus on at the start of a session with their client? And how long would it usually last? Like, how long is it a long form of therapy? Is it quite short term? Could you tell us about a bit of the practicalities of this model of working with people?
Yeah. With regard to long or short term, I suppose typically people would, practitioners may start with an idea of 6 to 8 meetings, giving the model and the engagement with the client a good shot. Having said that, there are active developments in creating single session act and useful outcome evidence to show its effectiveness. And again, I can work with people over a period of years, usually focused upon the continually focused upon the ACT model, and at the same time working with deeply entrenched, reoccurring, regressive patterns of behavior that need us both to go back to the basic principles, work again, and come back round to the hexaflex, which we haven't spoken about yet, but the way the model is visually presented as a reminder to people, swings from the acceptance side of the model to the commitment side of the model, and often the commitments are hard to keep or hard to move towards, and there's a swinging back to the acceptance side and to and fro. So I suppose it depends how psychologically rigid the people we're working with have become, how deeply entrenched in their patterns, which sadly are somewhat self-defeating. So okay, so that's the length of time. How do we work? To begin with, we'd work towards something that we call creative hopelessness. It's an interesting phrase. It sounds a bit of a paradox in itself, which draws attention to it, which I think is helpful. But by creative hopelessness, we mean the creativity that is liberated by recognizing the hopelessness of doing the same thing over and over again when it's clear that it doesn't work. And that takes some careful debriefing, because it's no good me just saying that as I've said it in a way. We need it to come not from the authority of a person you've only just kind of met. We need it to come from the client's own personal authority through a series of questioning about the things that they've tried and the experiences they've had of the efforts they've tried to overcome the issue that they've brought, to struggle with and overcome the issue that they've brought. And patiently together we work to a penny dropping moment, when the penny drops, which is, well, given all that you've told me, what does it tell you about trying that approach again? And there is that hopelessness feeling and the creativity at that point. Would you be willing to try a different approach? And that is the approach of really dismantling what we could call the control agenda, and as an alternative, offering the acceptance agenda.
Very interesting.
So rather than control unwanted inner experiences, we invite clients to accept unwanted inner experiences when and if that helps them move in the direction that truly matters to them.
Makes a lot of sense. So are there any situations where ACT is particularly effective, like any particular cases where it's been proven that it's a really effective treatment?
Anxiety is certainly, and generalized anxiety is certainly one of the most illustrative of cases of how effective it is. And just to perhaps give quite an approachable example, and a way I explain sometimes to clients who are struggling with that very unpleasant condition described as panic attack. If we think about panic attack as anxiety about having anxiety, we can see how we've got a sort of upward spiral there. It's a simple construction, panic attack is anxiety about having anxiety. And so if we can offer the acceptance agenda as an alternative to the control agenda, then instead of the first flickers of butterflies in the stomach and the tightening of the chest, and and then the gripping of the body as the control agendas applied, and then the mind getting full of, oh no, is this the beginning of a panic attack again? It's on that hyper anxiety about those first flickers of anxiety. If we can get in there as early as possible with techniques that allow us to accommodate those first flickers of anxiety and remove that second level of anxiety about anxiety, then we're just with what it is. We're with anxiety, uncomfortable as anxiety is, and how very human the experience of anxiety is too. But that capacity to, in a way, drop the struggle with the anxiety allows it to be anxiety. And the phenomenon of panic attack has no upward motor to wind us up. So that's perhaps a good illustration of its effectiveness, and certainly there's reams of outcome evidence, plus plenty of evidence of how each of the different core processes contribute to work with helping with anxiety. And something that's just been published a few days ago by Yale University is a handbook, a little manual, a recommended manual of using acceptance and commitment therapy with psychedelic assisted therapy. It's been discovered by Yale anyway, and its research teams, that ACT is the approach that lends itself best to helping with both preparation and reintegration sessions, therapy sessions, in the before and after of using psychedelics to assist with long-term depression.
That's super interesting. Just going back to the anxiety thing.
Yeah.
In his book, A Liberated Mind, Stephen Hayes, he says the important thing is that it's not really important what we think. That's not the important thing. It's how we. It's what we think and feel isn't important. It's how we relate to what we think and feel that's important. So whenever we have an anxious thought, and then we try and solve that with another thought, like that's the source of the problem. So it's changing our relationship to our thoughts. So is it in a way that we allow these thoughts to be without trying to change them, and then it's more likely to pass quicker? Or is that the approach that's been recommended here? Or could you maybe expand upon that?
Yeah, you're talking really there, or referencing two of the core processes. A core process that we call cognitive diffusion. Just to demystify that, because it's diffusion isn't really a word as such, although diffusion is the way a space is filled by a gas, or the way it's a chemistry term. Never mind about that. But diffusion is to perhaps take the fuse out of something, perhaps. But we're talking about a phenomenon of mind and of human experience whereby we become identified with what we think. So we almost overlook, if you like, that thinking is just another form of behavior. It's cognitive behavior, and like many behaviors in the whole of the sentient world, I suppose, the behaviors become practiced and routinized and habitual, and thinking, to quote I can't remember who it was who said it, but thinking is a great servant and a lousy master, because we can't actually kind of control what we think, although we tend to think we can, and that's why the control agenda that we previously spoke about is difficult, is seductive and very difficult. So yes, building a different relationship to our thinking, whereby we are in the perspective of being the noticer of thought, as opposed to being subjected to what we think. So as opposed to being, in a way, the subject of the thought, we are the observer, the witnessing of the behavior called thinking. And yeah, that's a way of talking about it. Another way of talking about it is, considering, can we afford to buy into that particular thought? So, this in a way is what we might call a cognitive diffusion technique, where there is a thought, I'm no good at job interviews, there's no point in me applying for the job. Now, can we afford to buy into that thought? In what way will it serve us to invest in that thought? And, if we buy in that thought, it'll perhaps serve us by not having to worry about the anticipated rejection at an interview. But in the long term, it certainly won't serve us in terms of getting a new job. And, if the value, the valued direction is around getting employment, then we'd do as well not to buy into that thought, to simply observe the thought. And recognize that we're having it, but not letting the thought have us. Again, just playing with the way we speak. We can have a thought, but make sure that we don't get had by it.
I love that. I love that idea that whenever you have a thought that's not particularly helpful, you can just ask, what will it cost me to buy into this thought?
Yeah.
It's really powerful.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. And this is the pragmatism, because we express our values in terms of thoughts as well. And but then, of course, identifying with the value, I am a kind, compassionate human being, or something like that. If that is then going to, direct our behavior, just in the way that identifying with the thought, I'm no good at interviews, is going to direct the behavior in the direction of not applying for the job, but with a valued thought like that, we can buy into that, because that's value all around, isn't it? That's value all around. Ourselves and everybody around us is going to find value in us believing in the thought, I am a kind and compassionate human being.
Fantastic. So it seems that psychological flexibility is a big part of the ACT model. So for anybody that hasn't heard of psychological flexibility before, could you just give us a brief kind of overview of what that means in simple terms?
Yeah, the whole model of ACT is around psychological flexibility, and if we have any, if you like, definition of what is pathological, it's based around inflexibility. So when ACT describes a pathology, we tend not to talk about it in terms of the DSM-5, wherever it's got, the way of labeling particular branches of human suffering. We see it generally, and that's why ACT is a transdiagnostic model. It works across a huge range of diagnoses. We tend to see it all in terms of psychological inflexibility, which is perhaps another way of describing the control agenda, gripping on certain rules in life. The rule like, I'm not that kind of person, or just as a simple one. So a definition that I use in my training of psychological flexibility is here. It's really describing psychological flexibility as having two components: the ability to be psychologically present here and now in the moment, aware, attentive, open to, and engaged in your experience. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but anybody who's actually sat down and practiced mindfulness meditation for only a few minutes will notice that hanging out there in this fascinating unfolding moment is challenging. Mind is off in the past, in the future, back we come again. And actually, if the present moment is a challenging moment for whatever reason, then the challenge goes up in terms of staying with it. But the challenge of staying with a present moment in the moment of challenge is the possibility of being present and responding to that moment, rather than the conditioned and habitual tendency to react to that moment in our various sort of escape strategies. So that's the first component, the ability to be psychologically present, aware, attentive, open to, and engaged in our experience. And then secondly, the ability to direct our behavior, and that's in the external world, to serve one's own valued ends. So in that moment of being open and aware to a situation, can I exert my agency in the direction of what truly matters to me in that moment?
Those two ideas, if you were just to internalize those two ideas and act them out in your life, like, it would make such a difference. Just whenever something happens, whenever something perhaps difficult happens, being able to stay with it, stay present, and then to choose your response based on your deeply held values and the kind of like long-term directions, as opposed to like an emotional reaction in the moment. Like, if you could do that, like, it would just have such an enormous benefit on your day-to-day experience of life. It's such a powerful concept.
And powerfully reflected back to me. I like the way you put that. Yeah, indeed. And, this isn't a destination. This is an ongoing process, just like mindfulness meditation is really. It's a myth that we arrive somewhere, some blissed out, permanent grip upon the present moment. It's all in process, really. And working towards psychological flexibility is something that we are on at times and we're off at times, but with those stated values and a personal familiarity with what matters to us, we can be in the midst perhaps of a dispute with our loved one, and in that moment of confrontation that we've so often ducked out of with a particular way of doing things. By being present and feeling all the experiences of that moment of growing confrontation, there's a possibility to choose a way of being assertive in the communication with, instead of the usual sort of win-lose kind of the method of communication that we've perhaps developed over years. We can go for a win-win solution which is clearly much more in line with our values. So that's the advantage of psychological flexibility.
That's really interesting. Now, maybe it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about psychological inflexibility and what that is, and why. I've just noticed in myself, and I think it's a human tendency in general. We seem to have an obsession with rules. Like, our minds can get very easily dominated by rules, and why is this? And is there any way useful ways we can overcome that?
I would suggest that those rules have proved helpful in the past sometime. Frequently, perhaps in childhood, and at times when we weren't in full adult agency. But rules that go, when this starts happening, what I do is this. and particularly if you've been brought up with any sort of background trauma in the family nexus, we've all got some form of trauma going on, and transgenerationally, trauma gets passed down the family line generation by generation, and And so a young person, a young vulnerable person, develops rules. You know, you don't express your emotions when mum's being emotional. It'll only come back at you. You'll be punished. You'll be punished for it. It's an example. So that previous example, just spontaneously came up with about being in an argument with your intimate other, perhaps. Maybe something there that, there's a rule that says, even in that moment of confrontation, that what makes flexibility difficult there is that there is a rule running that says, don't share your emotion at this point. Your partner is becoming emotional. And so flexibility about rules when we've become adult and in our agency and working towards becoming more open and more authentic as human beings is important. I think your question was why are they so around, ubiquitous, really? And I think it's originally around self-protection, but it was a much younger self. And if we're looking in a way to expand our sense of self, our self-concept, or even liberate ourselves from many of our self-concepts, then dropping some of our rules is going to be a prerequisite.
100%. That's really interesting. So now, Martin, I'd like to start to cover just maybe an overview of the 6 core processes of ACT. Like,
Yeah.
maybe if we could just briefly mention each one and then talk a little bit about what each one is, and maybe if you've got any examples of how someone might practice one of the processes, that would be really helpful for listeners too.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Very typically, people will know of the ACT model being presented visually around a hexagon, and just as a sort of a playful, another playful invented word, it's often called the hexaflex, because the 6 core processes are all around flexibility, psychological flexibility. And so on each of those surfaces of the hexaflex, we write, one of the core processes. So I'll just go round typically in the order that we tend to see them visually. So at the top left of the hexaflex, we've got acceptance or willingness. And I tend to think of that more in terms of our inner embodied experiences. Although everything on the left side of the hexaflex is around acceptance, really. But I find it best to think of it in terms of those butterflies in the stomach we spoke about earlier on. The many embodied experiences that all human beings have and are more or less in touch with, where it is helpful to help us move in a valued direction, then the capacity to accommodate those experiences rather than flee what produces them, or somehow develop a big internal battle to try and contain them and keep them in their place, limit their frequency or their intensity, where we can simply accommodate, make room for, then we are more flexible to meet the moment. So that's the core process we call acceptance or willingness. And sometimes it's useful to call it willingness rather than acceptance, because people get a bit muddled with the idea of resignation. You mean I've just got to put up with my anxiety? Not at all. There's something much more active about acceptance. It isn't about resigning and putting up. It's the opposite in a way. I best leave it there. But it's an active choice. It's not about being defeated. It's about moving forwards with courage. So acceptance and willingness are the first core process. And then as we come around the hexaflex, we'd be just thinking of the video. I'm perhaps going around that way, aren't I? We're looking at cognitive diffusion. We've spoken a little about that, and you wanted some examples of each. Incidentally, the previous one, acceptance, breath work, just doing some breath and using your breath to direct attention to the uncomfortable sensations and feeling your body expand as you breathe in, and literally kind of as you expand, feeling I am making room for this sensation. It's a powerful practice, semi-meditative, and that is one great way of working with acceptance. Cognitive diffusion, my favorite way is using my glasses, because nowadays I just wear them all the time because the reading glasses, they just disappear if I put them down, but it seems they stay while they're on here. But I like them as a cognitive diffusion device. Something about cognitive diffusion is that distance, setting up a distance between me and the thought that I'm having, as opposed to I am anxious. It is, I notice myself having the thought that, what if the sky falls down on me? Whatever. So there's a little bit of verbal distance there, but this is a good metaphor. It's actually using my glasses to represent a thought. So I notice the thought, it's no good me applying for that job. I'm no good at interviews. Okay, so I notice it, and it's in a way one of my usual suspects. It's been around every time I've thought of applying for a job, and there are a set of other thoughts like that. In fact, come to think of it, I haven't applied for a job for many years, and that thought is usually around. I'm no good at interviews. Now, while I'm noticing that, I can also look at the advert in the paper and consider it. But if I let this thought just kind of creep up on me unnoticed and end up on the end of my nose, when I look at the advert in the paper, off I go. There's no point. There's no point. And I don't actually see that I'm seeing the advert through the thought. I've been had by the thought. So finding a way of noticing that I'm having the thought is very helpful. So I'm just sharing a personal favorite of a kind of a visual metaphor of how we make some distance between the thought that we notice and ourselves as the noticer of a thought.
That's such a great metaphor, because it's sort of like the thought becomes fused with your lens of the world, and then whenever you take the glasses off,
again, beautifully put. That's it. And it is about fusion, isn't it? We become fused, and it is cognitive diffusion. Yeah. And the world is colored by the thought, and we don't notice that the thought's done it in a way. We believe it so heartily the key thing about the ACT approach is we don't dispute the verbal content of the thought. Now, other approaches, such as traditional CBT, will suggest, well, what would be a more helpful way of thinking this? Or can you supply evidence for how true that is? And so on and so forth. A problem with that is that we end up with a mushroom cloud of thinking about it. And it only takes the mind a moment to say, yes, but. And we've got another, if we come up with a sort of perhaps a more functional way of thinking about it, the mind going, yes, but, and then there'll be other things to do, and we'll be locked in thought. So we don't, in ACT, we don't even give the thought the credence to start disputing it. We just, it's just thinking.
Great. So that's two. What's the third?
That's two. I better get moving because there's another four to go. And there's one or two slightly tricky ones to explain, beautifully tricky ones to explain, actually, I should say. But the next one in some sort of order, really, the two at the top and the bottom of the hexaflex are present both in the acceptance side of the hexaflex and the commitment side of the hexaflex. And they're at the core. One of them is the capacity to be present in the moment. It's very similar in a way to mindfulness of the moment and in the moment, the ability to stay present and watch experiences come, last a while, and cease to be, and remain unmoved while you're practicing formal meditation. And perhaps there's a mindfulness in daily life, moving, but moving in valued directions. And so I perhaps don't need to say much more about that, except that it's well worth kind of cultivating as a regular mindfulness practice. And that's why I've given a lot of my life to teaching mindfulness practice. The one below, at the bottom of the hexaplex, is what we call self as context. And it is intriguing. It isn't easily captured in words. Usually in the trainings that I do, the 2-day introductory trainings, it's more about evoking an experience for people. It's just a momentary experience of a shift of perspective, really. Because much of the time, we are inevitably, almost as human beings, wedded or welded to our self-concepts, our sense of who we are often, as verbal descriptions. I am a man. I am a white British male on the later end of middle age. Whatever, sort of like almost like noun ways of thinking of ourselves. In ACT, we perhaps have 3 ways of thinking what is self. So there's the the inexhaustible numbers of verbal ways we could describe ourselves as nouns. When we're in meditation, we could describe ourselves in many ways as a process, as a selfing, rather than some static noun self. I am breathing, I am listening, I am vibrating. This is speaking about self as process. And that has moved out of our verbal descriptions of ourselves. Self as context, if we carry on using a language metaphor, is not a part of speech at all. It is, we could say perhaps it's the paper the sentence is written on. That wouldn't do either. Perhaps it's the person who writes the thing. But it's a part. It's awareness itself. It's not even owned by me somehow, although perhaps we don't go there. That's moving almost into a non-dual spiritual component to ACT. And ACT does have spirit, but we can't go too far in language to find that. The great thing about having another place to go, this self as context, this awareness perspective, is it allows for both acceptance and diffusion, or almost kind of immediately, because it's a transcended place. We transcend our experience in some respects. It's contained and transcended at the same time in this perspective, self as context.
This might be wrong. I'm not sure, but I remember reading in that book from Stephen Hayes. He was saying that a good way to think about it is think of kind of like the witnessing presence that was there when you were like 4 years old, was there when you were 10 years old, that's there now. There's something continuous about that.
Yeah.
That's kind of, is that a helpful way to think about this?
It is, and by extension, there's a lovely Zen phrase. What was your face before you were born? Which is pointing to the same, the same thing in a way. Yeah. But it is helpful to go back and just do some reflective and almost meditative exercises. Perhaps simply with a group of people, I might invite folks to bring to mind a memory of their holiday last summer, and in doing that, notice yourself finding the memory, and now inhabit the memory with as many sensory details as you can, and remind yourself of who was there. And as you're doing it, notice yourself doing that, and now going back to that memory, notice that you were there, that noticer was there, consolidating the memory in the first place. that aspect of you was there. The knower of experiencing was there to notice, consolidate, and commit to memory. And then we can regress that. We can keep going. And I enjoy going back to next to the last year at school, perhaps in higher education, and then to the last year at primary school. And people tend to get that there is this kind of permanent perspective in a way. And even though that every cell and every atom of our bodies is completely different from a material point of view, there is a sameness, a sense of self that was there to know this is happening.
100%. So is that 4 we've done or 5?
Yeah, that's 4. Yeah, and perhaps the other 2 are a little easier now. We're moving over to the right-hand side of the hexaflex, and we'll go to the top right. Values, that which gives our life meaning, purpose, and yeah, value. Working to help people identify that. We're often out of touch with it. It's not really something that we're invited to do throughout, however high we've gone in our education. We're not usually invited to consider what it is we truly value, even whether we truly value the education we're getting, for that matter. In terms of our personal heartfelt desires. I think recently Steve Hayes has been calling them our yearnings. I like that, and I like the pulling power that values have, a sense of being pulled from the future. So, if we're considering or encouraging our clients in behaviour change, then rather than it being a therapist's push in terms of being a cheerleader and go on, then go on, it's more the client's own values acting as beacons, a sort of come towards this, come towards what you said truly matters to you. So that's the why this aspect is so important in the model. We almost need to preload the work with a little bit of stuff on values, and the order of things depends according to different clients, and depends to some extent on how they engage in dialogue. And this is where the art of ACT comes, not to be formulaic, not to be too ordered, to be able to move around the hexaflex according to the demands of the moment and demonstrate that capacity to be present and in the moment and respond to it as a therapist as well. So once we've established values, then the last thing really is the commitment to act, committed action or goal setting, which is very familiar to most behavior change therapies. And the difference is here that we're doing behavior change not for the sake of behavior change, or not for the sake of perhaps conforming to societal expectations, but we're doing our behavior change in order to help us move towards this heartfelt yearning that we've worked to identify for ourselves. Yeah, there's a lot of finesse that we can look at in terms of goal setting. Setting smart goals. Bringing accountability to that, and by such and such time I will have done this, and so on and so forth. And there's the usual problems that will meet the intentions. In the homework, perhaps between sessions, a client may have committed to making a small but significant step in the direction of something that really matters, and it doesn't work out for a whole variety of reasons. And so next week we go back and we'll perhaps refresh how important the value is, and then we'll perhaps look at the acceptance strategies that could be used to cope with that gutted feeling just before you decided not to make the telephone call to the estranged relative, and then we can look at the thoughts that were the usual suspects, as I call them, I think that's a nice little metaphor. The usual suspects, those thoughts which take you hostage.
Yeah.
That's the crime.
So for values,
Mm.
it took me kind of a long time to kind of wrap my head around what values were and or what they actually are. And something that I found really helpful when I was thinking about this was to contrast values with goals. And
Yeah.
there's a metaphor of two hikers about to hike up a mountain, and one takes a values based approach and one takes a goals based approach. Okay, so the values based hiker knows before they go up that they really value curiosity and they value like deep conversations and exploration and presence and these things. So as they go up the mountain, they're kind of like embodying these values, and they enjoy the whole way up, and they enjoy the process of doing it. Whereas the goals based hiker is like, all he can think about is getting to the top of the mountain. So as a result, he misses all the beauty along the way and all these experiences. And it's kind of like, that's the kind of two approaches we can take to life: a values based approach where we kind of work out what's important to us and how we can move in a way that we enjoy the process, as opposed to just trying to get everything over and done with so we can get to the top of that mountain and move from there. Is that a fair way to describe the values based approach?
Yeah, I think it's very illustrative, isn't it? And of course the with that model, if you like, of those two, if those two hikers become hapless hikers and the weather is so bad and the peak is not reached, then our values-based hiker has still had a great adventure and had some wonderful conversations with whenever he can get the attention of his fellow hiker, and perhaps has really enjoyed how they made the decision to return and how they took some skillful decisions on the way down to return. Whereas all the way down, obviously the committed action person, the goal focused person, is just feeling disappointed and a failure. So that unpacks that a little further. So a really neat shorthand way of talking about values is qualities of being and doing. Qualities of being and doing. And it's so important to have both aspects, the doing and the being, in there. That my qualities of being and doing. Quite a handy way of just condensing it down, really.
Qualities of being and doing. I like that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I've heard it described that they're kind of like adverbs. Like you would say, like teaching clearly or giving gratefully, or it's always an adverb after something. Is that?
Yeah, well, that's definitely a qualifier, isn't it? A qualifying word. Yeah. In fact, sometimes helping people identify values, I'll use a so-called values card sort, 70 or 80 different small cards with values words written on them. Now, there's a few little problems here, as in our values need to be our values. So even presenting people with a list of values words, is a touch presumptuous. But nonetheless, it perhaps tunes the mind to just be thinking about what are values just by looking at the words we have in the language for them. But sometimes, people will mistake the exercise for these are the values. Then I must choose my value from the 70 or 80 cards. But I think of them more as vocabulary. Adverb vocabulary. I may want to be looking at what values do I bring in the world or the realm of my intimate relationships, and so then authenticity may be an important word that would describe my value in relationships. It wouldn't be the value, but it would be perhaps with authenticity. I communicate wherever possible with authenticity and patience and authenticity, or something along those lines. We build up with value words to create a mission statement, I find that's an ideal, is to be able to speak in that manner.
Very interesting. Now, I'm not sure if I'm getting the term right, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you've done some work on the ecological self.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about what that is and how that relates
Yeah,
to?
appreciate you asking me that question. And I've unpacked it a little further, which I'll talk briefly about then. So I've been very committed. One of my committed actions in the service of the value I place upon social and cultural change and playing a part in it. And indeed, I like to bring that to my work with my clients as well, in whatever way I can and wherever I get a chance. I will introduce the possibility of not only change, personal change, but also one's own contribution to the what I see as the absolute vital necessity for the human cultural change, and literally vital, and really feeling on the cusp of that, and wanting to play a part, really. So the ecological self has been around as a concept since developed by a deep philosopher called Arne Næss. I think he was a Danish philosopher. And then again taken forwards by people like Joanna Macy, who's been around, an inspirational woman in her 90s now, been around and teaching ever since I began social activism and before. I began in the 80s or so, and at that time she was running things called the despair and empowerment workshops to support people in the struggles during the Cold War, the peace movement, people who were burning out with their despair. And her beautiful insight was that if we can open up and accommodate our despair, and you can hear the echoes in act of that, then we can find resilience and stay committed to values of peace, peace as peace protesters, stay committed to that. But the ecological self, to me, seems utterly vital for us as individual human beings to truly understand ecological valuing. I've worked hard within the ACT community to introduce ecological valuing as, if you like, an extra realm of values that isn't in the traditional values sheet, where we help people go through different areas of their life to say what they truly value. And there's the very noticeable gap I felt in terms of ecological valuing, and that's because of something, proximity. We can talk about what we value in terms of intimate relationships because this is the person we live with in our house, or we can talk about what we value in terms of our family, because that's traditional values that have been around since biblical times. Many of our values are rooted in stuff that comes from the religions that were developed at that time, that knew nothing about what science is telling us now in terms of the ecological niche that human life and indeed all sentient beings occupy, that is very, very rapidly degrading on account of human behavior. And as we are working with human behavior change here, the science of human behavior change, it seems very, very important that we extend beyond the individual and to the collective. And so that's always there for me in my own life and all the various things that I do, apart from being a therapist of individual people, but also to help fire people up, individuals, to fire people up in terms of when in a way, when you've loosened this psychological inflexibility in terms of what you brought to struggle with, will you take your flexibility into the world and be a contributor to how human culture will evolve and can change? So it feels political, you know, it feels both personal and political. And I mean political, I don't know, in a small p or whatever, but you know, the politics of human survival here, you know, are beyond the personal preoccupations of each of us as individuals struggling with our rigid psychology, and you know, whatever, to the extent to which we can become liberated from that, can we contribute our insights into evolution, cultural evolution? Can we become evolutionaries?
So in some way, does this require shifting our perspective to almost identify with the planet or a larger, as you call it, ecological self? And that seems to be important, because if we're gonna value something, we might have to identify with it in some level as well.
Beautifully put, Niall. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's it. You know, we can have values like, you know, from a human point of view, we can perhaps say that we like to see nature, and you know, sense of using nature in a way. And the lifelong activist John Seed from Australia, when asked where does he get the if you like, the commitment to be still defending the rainforests, you know, 3-4 decades later, you know, when he first came to prominence in Australia doing that. And in a penny dropping moment, he said, I came to realize that it wasn't me doing the right thing anymore. It wasn't that. I was just that part of the rainforest that had woken up to its own destruction and wanted to take the right actions. And that was, you know, that's beautiful. And there are quotes around like that you just get it for a moment, where other people have got it and just felt into that. And you know, it really does take some cultivation to know that it's the quality of interdependency and interbeing, as the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh coined the term interbeing. So rather than individual human being, and the story of separation, which in a way our whole kind of cultural model runs on, you know, dog eat dog, sadly, still to some extent, competition, and so on and so forth. It's a story, a new, almost like we need a new narrative, and we're reaching towards it. And I think some of that will be actually having experiences, perhaps deep in nature, where we can feel our at oneness. And indeed, you know, I've had that privilege at times, you know, spending long times meditating in woodland and wilderness and just being and feeling that in moments of that interbeing that give us the energy for working beyond our own personal needs and desires. It's ecological valuing rather than my valuing. That's what excites me, and it isn't only around, you know, kind of global warming and climate change. It encompasses diversity, all sorts of the inequities of the current system, and I feel we all have a part to play in that. And it's not just about winning the game; it's about changing the game.
In terms of actually developing this perspective and this cultivating it, aside from spending time in nature and maybe meditation, is there any other things that people can do to cultivate this? Like, are there any books you would recommend, or any resources?
Active Hope by Joanna Macy is a great book. And it, you know, is a condensation of her work over decades, really, full of useful practices, and a great emphasis on working in group, because I think one of the ways we can get a sense of this is through group work. You know, group work with a facilitator that is keen to facilitate usness, a sense of usness, and it's working in the we space, if you like. You know, what we, how we can be, what we can do, and many small nodes of this, getting in touch with each other in some respects, networking, small units of it. We talk about it in the wonderful coming together of evolution science, biological science, social science, and the science of behavior change, which is known as the pro-social model. We talk about this as polycentric governance, small groups of people managing the commons, and coming together almost like a beehive of small groups working to group values rather than individual values, and then finding their way to, you know, to take it upwards in polycentric governance. It's an inspirational model, and you know, it's exciting to be part of that kind of work.
Brilliant. Well, Martin, I think that's a great place to end.
Yeah,
Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you online, or are there any resources you'd recommend people to go check out?
Yeah, myself it's an easy one. It's the 3Ws dot Martin Wilks with no E in the surname .com. So www.martinwilks.com. And I've also got a community interest company that I work with in the pro-social model with 5 colleagues, and that's 3 dots BWIS, that's BWIS, it stands for Being Well in Suffolk. I live in Suffolk in the UK. Dot online.
It's bwis.online.
Yeah.
Cool. We'll link to these in the show notes for the interview.
That's great, thanks. And then generally for the Association of Contextual and Behavioral Science, which is the kind of mothership of these this particular therapeutic approach, functional contextualism, and a variety of other therapy approaches that are fellow travelers that live within it. That's just go looking for ACBS. I'll just get the link for you. There won't be a second.
We can start.
You can get that together yourself. Yes, okay.
Yeah, after. Don't worry about it.
That is a huge resource where many teachers share their particular ways of teaching. There's a whole journal. It's a values-based membership site, so that you can get much of the stuff there for free, and some stuff you may have to join, but you can decide what it's worth to you, which is a good principle really to demonstrate.
Great. Well, Martin, thanks again. I really appreciate it, and best of luck to you going forward.
Thank you, Niall. Yeah, I appreciated you giving me the chance, particularly to share my enthusiasm for the latter part of the session.